Welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think. My name is Ariane Rice. I am an ordained Episcopal priest and leadership coach, and I host conversations with professionals in the church and outside the church to talk about leadership, spirituality, and how we live into who we are becoming in our work and in the world. I am thrilled and delighted that you are here. So let's get started. There is a story in the Gospels, and you know it whether or not you've ever read the Bible. And that's because you have probably watched the movie The Exorcist, or at the very least, seen this pretty famous clip. In that movie, the demon to be exorcised in the young girl tells the priest, "Our name is Legion." And that comes from a story in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. You see, there's a man, a demoniac, and he is possessed. Jesus is on a boat. He takes the boat across the lake, and he encounters the man who has been chained into the graveyard, and we hear that he is wandering among the tombs. It is a really sad and depressing image and conjures up for many of us the image of someone who has been cast out of their family, of their community, of who they used to be left to wander alone with whatever demons they are struggling with. Well, when the man meets Jesus, the demons inside him, and here's a little fun fact, in the Gospels, the demons recognize Jesus way more than the people do for who he is and what he's come to do in the world. And those demons say to him, "Our name is Legion. Leave us alone." And of course, Jesus does not. He heals the man, exorcises the demons from him, and of course the man is overcome with gratitude and, he's been completely healed. So he says to Jesus, "I want to come and follow you." But Jesus says, "Actually, I think it's best for you to go home and go to your friends and tell them about this wonderful thing that has happened to you and retake your place in community." Today, my guest is the Reverend Jared Weber Johnson. Now, it's not often that I think of a horror movie after editing a conversation I've had, but one of the mind-blowing insights, and there were many, I had when I studied scripture for the first time in seminary, was that, yes, Jesus heals people. We all know that. But it's not solely about the action of bringing one person back to sound body, mind, and spirit. It's not just about bringing one person back to wholeness. He heals one person and then he restores them to their place in community. The healing of one human being is a catalyst for a whole group of people to be restored to right relationship, to be renewed, and to see what is possible in one person. And when that one person is healed, the whole community is made whole. Well, today in my conversation with Jared, we covered a wide range of topics, but one of the recurring themes is the formative and restorative power of community. Communities that we are born into, our families are community. The communities that shape how we learn, move, and have our being in the world, the communities we choose, the communities who choose us, especially those communities that we are called to lead. I hope this conversation prompts you to reflect on the communities that you have been a part of, how they have shaped you, how they are shaping you right now, and let's face it, what are the ways we can all be a part of making stronger, more loving communities in wherever it is we live? I'm so thankful for Jared for taking time to talk with me, and I do want to share one note. We do talk about suicide in this conversation because it is something that we share in terms of family members. So if that is something that is not a topic you want to engage with right now, then please take care of yourself. Okay, Thanks again for being here. Thanks, if you have, for taking the time to follow or share or write a quick review of this conversation. And any of the books we talk about you can find on my bookshelf at bookshop.org. All right, now let's get to my conversation with Jared. Hey, Jared Weber Johnson.
Hey, Ariane, how's it going?
It is going phenomenal because, as I told you 2 minutes ago, I'm at the beach, which is a place that makes me incredibly joyful. And
Yeah,
I'm seeing you. Like, we haven't seen each other and hung out in a very long time.
it's been a hot minute. It has been a while.
I remember the
Absolutely.
last time we saw each
I
other,
mean, which was when?
gathering of leaders,
Oh, that's right.
when I couldn't breathe
So,
at the top
wait,
of a mountain in Colorado.
it was a lot. That was a weekend of extremes or a week of extremes because I was one of the five of us planned, the planning team, and so like we all had parts to play, and so you're there with all these really cool people, and you want to just dive in and be a part of it. But you're working, you're thinking each session through. But then the weather was extreme because it was springtime, so like they would snow and then it would be 70, and
Yep.
and then it was the altitude. It was all sorts of extremes.
Yep. I remember that retreat, gathering of leaders, had some sort of invitation that said, if you think you want to be a bishop. Am I correct in that?
I think that's right because we did kind of open space facilitation, and I should say it was the gathering. There's gathering of leaders, which is different. This was
Correct.
just the gathering, Gen X and millennial clergy. But yeah, there was like a specifically Episcopal oriented conversation.
Okay, now that we've been talking, let me pause because I would love you to introduce yourself, say a little bit about who you are and whatever you want to say, and how you live into your vocation in the world these days.
Fabulous. My name is Jared Weber Johnson. My vocation is priest in the Episcopal Church. I'm the rector, which for non-Episcopal types means just priest in charge or pastor in charge of St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church, which is a medium-sized parish or congregation in St. Paul, Minnesota. We're in the historic Ramsey Hill neighborhood. And I am also a father of two wonderful young boys, Simon Henry, who's 10, and Jude, who is 14 and just started high school about a week ago. Not even a week ago.
Wow.
It's been a few days. It feels like eons have happened, and yet it's only been a few days. And I'm married to the love of my life, Erin Weber Johnson, who's been a previous, I think,
Phenomenal
participant
previous
in
guest. Yeah.
yeah, guest on the show. So we live here in St. Paul. We've been here now since 2011, and so we just entered our 13th year this summer. And part of our life is, of course, our vocations, but I think, and our life as married people and parents. But the other thing that is new to us is we spend a lot more time on what the Minnesotans call the North Shore or up north,
Okay.
because we now have a cabin up near Grand Marais, and so we kind of split our time. 90% is here, but we do spend a good 10% of our year up near Lake Superior and in the woods, and that's a big part of who we are. So
That's amazing. I mean, it
yeah.
sounds amazing. That's a part of the country that's completely unknown to me, but it sounds beautiful.
It's a lot like Maine or the coast of Maine, kind of not extreme mountains, but high hills, and then the
Hmm.
same kind of plant life. And
Hmm.
because Lake Superior is an inland sea, it kind of does have a coastal feel to it. So
So
yeah,
you and I know each other from the General Theological Seminary. That's when we probably spent, well, that's when we met. That's when we spent the most time together. And I don't know about you, but I feel like that was 5 minutes ago and a lifetime ago all at once.
yes, yes.
So I would love you, in whatever way you want, to say a little bit of the story of how you got to be where you are today and doing what you do today.
Absolutely. Well, so General Seminary in Chelsea, in Manhattan, in New York City, is was a I think a I would have never in my wildest dreams imagined that I would have been living in or going to school in New York, or that I'd been. And maybe I kind of had an inkling I'd study theology in college or high school, but I certainly didn't think that New York. So
Really?
that
Why?
was a I've always been a West Coast kid.
Oh,
Most of my roots are in the Midwest, so New York was sort of never in my orbit. So how I got there, I grew up in Southeast Alaska. That's where my parents went for work, my dad particularly, but my mom also taught up there. And when I was probably 13, I started to sense I wasn't yet an Episcopalian. I wasn't even in a mainline tradition. I was kind of, I'd like to say a mutt,
mhm.
because it's a small rural village. You kind of go to whatever religious establishment is where your peers go. So we were Assemblies of God for a season. We were Presbyterian for a season. My mom grew up a part of the Free Methodist Church, which is a pretty small denomination, a branch, obviously, of Methodism through the Holiness movement. And her family is kind of very tied in there. So there was a strong pull to find that again. But in our town, there wasn't any Free Methodism. So we didn't go, but we kind of identified as that. I felt a tug to ministry, and I articulated it early in my dating relationship with Erin. We met at a Free Methodist college in the Midwest in Southern Illinois.
Okay, wait,
And
time. Just time out a little bit.
yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
say, I felt a tug to ministry.
yeah.
What was that?
I, I mean, you knew me when, like right as my frontal lobe was finally freezing up for the first time. So it was hard to put like words to what that tug was, but it sensed that I wanted to, I mean, our family and my extended family always used the language of ministry. Like we talked about life in the church, and a lot of evangelicals do. Like there's this sense that the world can exist within this church bubble, and then there's everything else. And
Mhm.
I had missionaries in my history and in my family history. My grandfather was a medical missionary. My uncle was and still is in the church, but was the head of Free Methodist missions for all of Southeast Asia. I had an aunt and uncle who studied theology in England and lived there and pastored there for a while. And so like that was sort of the language of our family.
Mhm.
And so I always sensed I would do something that would be couched in terms of serving in the church somehow. Ordination wasn't necessarily a category I had in mind, but
Mhm. What
I
was
just
the
I
what? Sorry, do you mind if I interrupt? I'm sorry.
go
It's
for it.
hard because people talk, and then I want to ask so many questions. But what was the God of that church? Like when you were that age and that was happening, what was God then?
My image of God, they say, psychologists say, is often tied to your parents and who they are. There's an old NPR, like a book of stories that an NPR journalist told years ago called "I Thought My Father Was God" or "Thought My Dad Was God."
Mhm.
But it's sort of under that rubric of our God identity comes from parent figures, especially for many, their fathers, but just generally those respected adults. And so for me, I was lucky that I had parents who were theologically moderate in the midst of a very kind of fundamentalist world.
Mm.
And so for me, God was someone who was active and alive in the world, but God was somebody who needed people to be about the business of helping out, like doing something. So everything from, like I said, my grandfather was a medical missionary, so he had a passion for the poor, even though he probably identified as somewhat of a conservative evangelical. Like he had liberation in mind. Like it was something that I was exposed to at a very early age. It was tied up intimately with saving souls for Jesus, so they didn't go
Right.
to hell. But it was still one that said, hunger and healing, medical healing, bodily liberation is still a part of that. I like what God is calling us to be about. So I had that in my image. I also grew up in a native village. Yeah, so the spirituality of where I grew up was deeply intermingled with indigenous identity. I mean, kids in Alaska, no matter if they're Anglo or not, at least up until when I graduated in the 90s from high school, had a required curricula called cross cultures that we were elders from the indigenous community would come into the school, and there was like an hour a day set aside, kind of like PE, health, biology, and you would also then do either drawing or dance or language
Mm.
work around the local indigenous tribe so that the kids from that tribe were preserving their culture in the midst of a long history of colonialism that tried to erase it. I wasn't intimately aware of that history, but I was learning the stories, the myths, the identity of Tlingit and Haida people as
Wow.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year old, I can still draw the shapes, which are kind of like icons. They're like very set forms that you're supposed to learn before you can expand to
Mm.
animals and creatures. So yeah, my sense of God included all that. My parents were good friends with local Roman Catholics, and even though they were not Roman Catholic, were invited to be godparents. So we would go to mass for those special occasions. And our local Catholic church was built like a Tlingit longhouse, and it had images at the front, like the cross was imbued with the ovoid forms and U forms of the local art. And so you could see how, I mean, even our Presbyterian church, when we worshiped there, had the raven and the eagle coming to a lighthouse, and raven and eagle being the two matrilineal lines in Tlingit and Haida culture. Like everyone identifies under one or the other. So there was some of that, like it wasn't even syncretism, just like intertwining of culture and sense of God and spirit at an early age up there.
And in a gorgeous, beautiful place, I would think, like creation.
Yeah, it was, and my dad was a biologist and a conservationist, and he would have never identified as an environmentalist, but definitely someone who cared a lot about the natural world and took us out into it every single day. I mean, our house faced the ocean, so we watched whales at breakfast on the regular, and we just spent a ton of time outdoors. And yeah, it's gorgeous up there if you like misty, rainy, foggy. As somebody told me once when I was in college in Illinois, yeah, we took a cruise up there and it's beautiful if you like trees. Like, yeah, there's a lot of trees.
Like I'm noticing how you were saturated in so much like that theological of different types and strands and strains, and part of it like a real part of your family, but then a lot of outside and a lot of openness to the various things there without being judgmental and divided. And it sounds like
Yeah.
even though people were in their lanes of their religion, there was still an ecumenical sense of, but this is our community. Is that right? It just sounds like a really good
Yeah,
environment for a healthy, burgeoning faith.
it was, and I think can be there. I mean, it's funny because certain strands of fundamentalism, and particularly fundamentalism, can try to erase that sense of the pull and tug and dialogue between multiple strands, which was very present in my community. But there was just this other, as I've just described, other very dominant intermingling. So I talked about the Catholic Church and the Presbyterian Church. The Catholic Church didn't get built until I was in middle school. And so for decades, the Catholics worshipped on Saturday evening at the Presbyterian Church, and the Presbyterian pastor and the Catholic priest always had a relationship. And you know enough as priests, we know enough about particularly Catholic theology about what can be consecrated, what can be touched, who can use it.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, there was such a gracious kind of flexibility to allow those two communities to function together. The Lutherans didn't have an outpost, but there was always a pastor commissioned to come through town on a boat once a month. So the Lutherans always worshiped with the Presbyterians until the pastor was in town for confirmations or for, other big Lutheran life
Mm-hmm.
marking events. And they would go down to the dock and they would meet with the Lutheran pastor for that.
So one of the things I'm curious what your response to this would be. My theory, hypothesis at this point in my life, if you do not have on some level a really good exposure to faith and a healthy way of it being a life-giving, more than just me, more than just a personal salvation, it's going to be very difficult for you to align yourself with a denomination in your adult life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that theory is proving out in a lot of studies too. I mean, I think a lot of my liberal friends who are not churchy, we were talking before you started recording about like our peer groups. And I one of my closest friends is not Christian here in town that we do a lot together. And, as a priest, I find that often very relieving to be able to have conversations with someone who's not in my world and talking shop. But I think I've met a lot of non-church people who are progressive or identify as liberal in particular, who have very fundamentalist thinking about the God they don't believe in because they just didn't have exposure to an environment growing up where there was dialogue, flexibility, change, transformation. It was very static.
Okay, so just to continue this, because this is something I'm very interested in. Now, I heard what you were saying earlier about the idea that, God is our parent, that we learn an image of God from parent. Like, yes, I get that. However, I don't think you can kind of take that too far. Like it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Right.
sometimes I think the stumbling block, and please, people who are spiritual but not religious, do not let me offend you because I put myself in that category too sometimes.
Yeah.
I think sometimes the stumbling block is a real desire to avoid dealing with some of the childhood trauma, childhood challenges that are kind of have nothing to do with religion. But if you can kind of see how much of that influenced what your thought thinking is around an institutional church, and kind of say, like, that's not all that it is. It's not that one thing.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Then sometimes there's the possibility, because, you and I'm going to assume there's so many problems with church. And it is
Oh
such
yeah.
an amazing, wonderful place. Right?
Yes.
I mean, the
Yeah.
community you're describing, like that you had in childhood, sometimes I want to encourage people to separate the idea of religion that they've carried all their life and let it go. Like maybe they want to do some healing around that, maybe not, but to just be like, that's not all it has to be. And there's more there. And I can be open to more of the complexity of what the institutional church is and offers.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, on a more on a very pragmatic level, I can acknowledge all the horribleness of any church, ours included,
Yeah.
and the damage it does. And at the same time, I don't know how we get whole without community and connection. And every community has to put down boundaries, definitions, categories. I mean, unless you're an anarchist and so you're like, I don't want to offend any spiritual but not religious. I don't want to offend any anarchists. But but I just think like it's really hard for us to grow and to heal as people without being connected. And that's all religion is. It literally means religamented, to be rebound and connected to each other. And we do that by defining community. And take out religion, we're a liberal democracy,
Mhm.
or and we have to define how we're going to live in community with each other. We have laws and rules and means for being in relationship. That's how we move forward. I know that sounds really traditional and like,
And not
but
well, I mean, I think it does and it doesn't, but I also hear some of what you're saying is what people are longing for in society outside of church. Like, how do we live in community? How do we talk
right,
about things that are difficult when we have differing opinions and ideas? We don't always do that in church because some of our beliefs are homogenous, although we try and
mm,
encourage, I think, in Episcopal and Protestant traditions, well, some of them, a little more of a bring your thinking brain, don't just take the dogma that's handed to you.
right, right,
So, like, just before we started recording, you talked about loving to spend time with your Buddhist friends
right,
and
right.
how you see the similarities. Like, it's just institutional church, it doesn't matter the denomination.
It doesn't. I mean, and it's not to like minimize the importance of like the traditions of which we're a part of, or the richness that we come from. It's just I love your point, Ariane, of just saying like let it go, like holding it loose enough that it doesn't become an anchor, or a millstone. Like we can love it, respect it, and yet also hold it loose enough that it doesn't sunder us when it doesn't work. Like when it fails, because it's gonna break.
So, I'm curious if there's some sort of story that you can think of or that you can remember when you think about how you've grown and changed, not just from that particular time in childhood, but more, I mean, curiously about since we knew each other in seminary and we go into this line of work with so many grand ideas and maybe some big fears. But tell me some things, tell me some experiences that have been really formative for you as a leader
Mm,
in the community
mm.
too.
That's really good. I mean, sometimes it's subtle and not defined to like one moment. Because when you ask that question, what I think of are the myriad experiences that are just steering me towards the human I'm growing into that feels good. Like I don't know, like if you've experienced this as we've aged, because we're not the kids we were when we were in grad school, but I definitely feel more at home in myself
Yes.
than I ever have in my life. Like, and it continues to feel that way. Like I feel more and more at home in myself. And I think that has been in part, yes, my own hard work, but I think a lot of it too. I wonder about other vocations, whether that happens, because my people have shaped me. Like
Yeah.
they've corrected and reproved me, and and challenged me and loved me. And, it hasn't always been easy. In fact, a lot of it has been really hard. And not all of it was intentionally to shape me, but I feel like I've received it all as a lot of it, not all of it. That would be very magnanimous of me. I've received a lot of it as gift, and it's shaping who I've become. Like when you walk with people, I've been here now. I never imagined I'd be in one place for over 10 years.
I want to hear
By
more about that too, but keep going.
Well, I mean, because when you and I met, we had lived like 8 or 9 places in like
Yep.
8 or 9 years. That's that stage of life, different houses, different towns, different jobs. And so there's this sense of when being rooted here, and every person that I've loved and known and buried, like you go back and you look at the story of knowing that person and
Mm-hmm.
what they've given you. So I
Mm.
think on like a much more like long scope, that's what's really been changing me. Has been the relationships with people, and then the wrestling to be faithful as a priest and as a pastor in the midst of those relationships, because that's a role I play in this community, and I have to try to sense what is faithful right now, what is authentic, what have I been called to do here. And when I got you started this question with like, we all have these big ideas. We all have vision.
You were one of
Yeah.
the bigger idea people, if I remember.
Yes. Sidebar. I've worked with now 3 associate rectors here and loved working with each of them. And one of them, when she left, handed to the new associate rector a little tiny stuffed squirrel and said, "You can just hold this up when the rector starts getting off on his idea like train. Just don't chase the squirrel, Jared." That was a really nice way that you put that. You've always been a big idea person. Where were we?
Well, okay, let me back up because I had a question.
Yeah.
Because I was agreeing so much with this idea of in relationship is how we grow in our humanity, and a huge part of the humanity that we bring to our leadership in various lines of work. And that's one of the gifts of ministry I never anticipated, that because my job requires being a mature Christian, which I interpret as being a mature human being, because I see a lot of, just like in many other faith traditions, the practices are really meant to help us mature psychologically, physically, spiritually, emotionally, intellectually.
Right.
Because I've had to practice that and taken it seriously, like you said, worked on myself a lot, i.e., a lot of therapy, a lot of humbling work about learning who I am.
Yeah.
It is a gift that people have given me that is hard to express. And I agree with you, having stayed at a place in a long time, finding myself doing the funerals of more people who have been a part of that journey is starting to get, and I think maybe the pandemic had something to do with this too. It's getting a little, it's hard. It's just hard. I don't know what to say. I cry at almost every funeral I do for a parishioner that's meant something to me.
Yeah. I confess that I have, I'm sure no other clergy person does, a sort of frame for a funeral sermon for someone that I, don't know well, because
Exactly.
it always annoys me when a clergy person tries to pretend like they knew a person
Right.
and they don't when you go to a funeral. But more just to be honest, like my role isn't eulogy, my role is something else. And
Yep.
so what are the key points you have to touch on? But as I've been here longer, I've found myself like I can't be here authentically as myself without authentically acknowledging my connection to the
Mm-hmm.
deceased. And so my preaching has changed in dramatic ways at many of the funerals, probably a majority now, because the stories are just, they're right there. They're, like they're at the tip of your tongue. Yeah, I cry at every single funeral now. Like,
Oh, good. I'm glad I'm
yeah,
not. I mean, I don't like fall apart, because I do remember
no.
being told that that was not okay. And of course, that makes people uncomfortable. But I think there's also an aspect, I'm kind of obsessed with emotional intelligence and how that connects to our spirituality. But I think there's an aspect of wanting to acknowledge the depth and fleeting nature of the shared emotion in a space of a funeral,
Mm,
which,
mm.
is a lot of things at once, and is very powerful and a very healing thing for a group of people to acknowledge and really be there and be okay with it, which is why I love our liturgy, because it makes it safe.
Absolutely. In fact, it's one of the most loaded liturgies we do because it has so much theology. It's sort of like Easter Vigil. It holds so much language about transformation and redemption and kind of the core tenets of Christianity, as it well should. It's, it's a key moment, but it works emotionally, which is what always, I think, hits me as something I'm comforted by. But you stand at the back of the church and shake hands with everyone leaving, and like obviously people are looking for a word to say as they leave a church and meeting a stranger, but to a person, almost everyone says like, that was such a beautiful service. I've been to a lot of funerals outside the Episcopal Church. I don't always feel that way. And I'm not throwing shade. It's just, there is something there that we can all be proud of in the Episcopal Church that does work emotionally. It makes emotional, intelligent sense. It connects us to each other.
So that connects me with something I want to talk about, because for my personal experience, I also think a reason why those services are very powerful is because I've had my own personal experiences of being at funerals. And I've said this before, I know, on this podcast. When my sister ended her life, that funeral and being the sister in the funeral, participating as I was able, being with my daughter and my family, that forever changed how I handled funerals from there on out. And you and I, unfortunately, share this in our family history. And so that's my opening to ask if you would share some of that story, if you're comfortable doing so, in whatever way you want, and how it's formed you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Ariane alluded to, my father, we share this tragic experience of both having a loved one commit suicide. For me, it was my father. And it was in 2009 when I was just getting ready to graduate and be ordained, graduating from general in May. He took his life in January, or was it February? All blurs together, but it was sort of there in the dead of winter. And before telling that whole story, I will say that the part you were saying about how it changed the way you do liturgy, in particular around funerals, it was the humorous part of that whole experience was that my father wasn't Episcopalian. He was nominally Presbyterian at the time, and he committed suicide in Seattle and lived in Alaska. And so, the way death works, a body has to stay put for a while, and especially when the death is a suicide or a homicide or under any other potentially investigated process, there's like it slows everything down. So we were kind of stuck with needing to do some of our rites of closure in a place that we had we did have connections. There was some family there, and people flew in, and my sponsoring parish happened to be in Seattle. I was living in New York, obviously, at the time, but there were enough touch points to make it healthy and whole and surrounded by love. But it was bizarre because we didn't have a home faith community there to kind of host it. And so we kind of, me being at the time very reluctant to grieve and unable to know how to grieve well, because I never had a major loss in my life. I was 29 at the time. Wow. And we were pregnant and expecting our first kid, which was a whole nother story of surprise. And we never had seen ourselves as potentially parents. So I thought I was doing the noble son thing and said, I'll design a liturgy because I've just gotten all this training and I'm really good at it. And so trying to bridge like my dad's Baptist upbringing and I know he wanted certain kind of old time hymns, and that there was no other Episcopalians there. So not wanting to foist my own liturgical sensibilities, and God, what a mishmash that first ceremony was. What I took from that, you said you changed how you do liturgy, is that to the best of your ability, always hand like liturgy around your own life to someone else.
Amen.
We learned that in liturgy class. Oh my God, I wish I could go back and find a valiant person to hand that to and sort of smack my own hand away from it. Like, stop. Like, just go into that space where you can grieve, where it's designed to make you emotionally connected, as you had described earlier. So that whole experience kind of cemented my sense of what not to do. And we ended up doing 3 or 4 different ceremonies because his family, his parents were too old to travel. So we did something in his hometown in Ohio. We ended up doing something in Alaska months later around committal. And then there was like a celebration of life for all the people in town that wanted to celebrate him. So there were like multiple ceremonial points.
First of all, I'm sorry for your loss. I know it was a long time ago, but I'm still sorry. I'm also sorry because I just don't remember. I don't remember anything about that, Jared. When your wife told me, I was shocked that had happened when we were all at seminary together. Because I feel
Mm.
like, how did we not all come
Mm.
around you? Or maybe you had your people and they did. Um, but this might sound like a strange question, and I don't mean it to be rude. If I put myself in your shoes, I would also have a feeling in me. I cannot believe one of my parents decided to do this as I'm about to launch my life into the world. And I think I would have a lot of difficulty, which I had some with my sister, reconciling my feelings of anger and my feelings of sadness and helplessness.
Yeah, no, that's not a rude question. That's a really emotionally intelligent question. Yeah, I still will cycle through, we learn in pastoral theology that it's not really stages of grief because that makes it seem linear, but
Mm-hmm.
more like a ever zigzagging between places in grief. And anger is a well-worn like depot in my grief process. Like I go back to it a lot. In part because, we talked about our images of our father or our parents being an image of God. And I mean, like a lot of younger sons or just sons, I had a sense of wanting to make my dad proud and to keep up with the image I had of him, like kind of, to do good by that image. And so keeping up is an image that in therapy I worked a lot with. This earliest images of my dad were following him on deer hunts through the brush, and it was always never on a trail, and always like getting slapped in the face and trying to keep up my small legs, like, but trying to prove that I'm good enough to be there with dad.
Mm.
um and so when he went somewhere that I couldn't go, it was like, you know pardon my French, fuck you, dad. Like
Yeah,
like
exactly.
I can't keep up, like I'm not going to go there. And so that was, yeah, anger comes up quite regularly. Yeah, we were pregnant with Jude, and that was a blow to just say, like, in fact, our last conversation, the night he took his own life, he was doing what a lot of people do, either writing notes or connecting with. Not everyone goes silently into that dark night. Some
Right.
people reach out without saying what's going on. They'll just reach out. And his cell phone history was just huge that last day, because he was calling everyone to sort of have a last word. And his last word to me, which I didn't know at the time, was, "You're going to be a great dad, Jared."
Oh,
Which, was a loving, sweet thing to say, and also just made it. I was like,
yeah. Oh,
screw
it
you,
makes
dad. Like,
right, because why can't you stay to see it?
yeah. I mean, and he had been there for my brother's kids to see them grow up a little bit, and they were earlier in their process of having children, and he was such a great grandfather too. To like, there was a bitter pill, which is, nothing against my brother and his family. Like, I know they felt the same. Like, now their kids are in high school and going off to college, and all of those things you imagine that a grandparent might be able to bless with their presence, and as a child of that parent to be able to share the joy, and all of that was kind of robbed. So
Was
anger,
it something that
absolutely.
was totally, you had no idea this was a part of his mental health background, or was this something that had there been, I mean, my sister had multiple attempts before that.
Yeah. So the story of the descent to suicide is a long one. My father had a criminal history that was, as a white collar worker and a well respected person in town, was always, I think, a huge understandable source of shame for him, that had happened almost 8 or 9 years earlier. And so I don't think he ever fully, because I'm pretty sure he wasn't in consistent therapy. If he ever went, there was no healing from that sense of
Hmm.
shame, right? Shame is a
Hmm.
huge
Yep.
uh, uh, source of disconnection and illness, mental health problems. So he'd really never fully healed. He had always been a little bit of a depressive, and although never fully diagnosed, he had recently changed meds when his first attempt happened.
Mm.
um, he had had a stroke, and everybody, 4 or 5 years earlier, and everybody thought that this was, that his first attempt was just a stroke. He fell out into traffic, in a town where the speed limit is 20. So it was a very, very poor attempt. Everybody just thought he had passed out on the sidewalk and fell into the street. And so he got help, and people sent him to Seattle for neurological testing. But there were a few of us who wondered at what was going. That just didn't seem like the answer. But
Hmm.
when it's suicide and a loved one, I know a lot of people who can look back in retrospect and say, "Oh, I wish I had done something." Through my own therapeutic work, I've let go of my sense of failing to have done something there.
Likewise, that thanks also to my therapeutic work have let go because there was
Yeah.
nothing I could do.
Right, right. So I mean, I was suspicious then, and I asked a lot of questions, but he was going to a doctor, so I thought, well, they're going to get to the bottom of this. And it was only, a week later, 4 or 5 days later, even that he was able to complete suicide. If the first attempt was appeared like a cry for help, he didn't get that help, and so I think he had more resolve
Mm.
to do it, and so it was much more effective. He not to go off on a side tangent, it was a beloved family member, but they had a mutual love of hunting, my father and this family member, and so he was staying with them in Seattle area to go to neurological visits, and he, in his plan, asked the family member about this new hunting rifle, and it was shown to him, and they admired it together, and it was left unlocked in the house.
Mm.
Um, so a side tangent of like, lock up your firearms, people.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. I'm sure you, like me, have found yourself with parents, with siblings, with friends of people who are living through this story in different ways. How are you with them? And what are the ways in which you utilize what you've been through to be a pastor?
It's a great question. So there seems to be if I understand your question, there's an element to go backwards. You said you weren't aware that this had gone on, and shouldn't the community have come around me? And so one of the things that happened actually when my father took his life was, so that happened in the winter of our final semester of seminary, and people came around us. That was our experience. So my bishop at the time, who I wasn't close to, paid for everything because we were
Oh,
broke. Our trips out to Seattle, somebody in the church, whether it was the bishop or whether it was our church, home parish, covered the cost of cremation.
mm,
Like things that I was too in a fog, that I've had to be reminded by my loving wife, Erin, later. Like, yeah, that's who did this and that's who did that. We were pregnant, and so part of the work that we had to do, and I couldn't, but I know Erin was doing, was trying to have joy about being an expectant mother in the last trimester,
mm,
in the midst of this grief, and our community, many of whom knew that this had happened. Some didn't know it was suicide, some just knew my father died, but the whole seminary kind of came around us with showers, baby showers, and the tradition at General, on the last night with seniors, there's a banquet, and there's usually toasts given, and
mm.
the inimitable J. Robert Wright would always offer a toast to Mary as the opening toast, I think
Of
it
course you
was.
would.
But then immediately one of our classmates stood up, and they knew our son was going to be named Jude, and led the entire assembly in singing "Hey Jude." So there was just these
Oh,
like radiant, like glorious moments of love, like the community surrounding us. And that has shaped my ministry dramatically. When people are in grief, give them anything you can give without giving away yourself, like support them, love them, uphold them, bring the community around them. Like, it goes a long way
it does.
downstream.
I'm very grateful to hear the community because that's exactly one of the reasons I think people don't realize what they miss when they let go of having a faith community in their life. People come around you that you would never think would be the people that do, and you can't even imagine what that kind of gratitude does to heal.
Absolutely, well said. Yeah. So I mean, in really short, to take that whole story, is that you asked the question, like, how has that shaped my interactions with people that are close to me, and then also my ministry. It definitely has shown me, like, that you can never be too abundant around grief. Like, it
Mm.
requires the oceans of love, and you can't give it all on yourself, on your own. So that really, as a pastor, it's trying to draw more people together. That's been a sort of practical outgrowth of it, has been realizing we need to all see our lives as mutual caregivers in community. In my relationships with people, I mean, back to the question about anger, like, I've been an angry person a lot of my life since then. There've been
Mm.
lots of wrestling and dealing with, like, being angry, and that it comes out in the wrong places. And so that has driven me to therapy and to do the work. And I'm not there, but it has changed me and has changed how I'm in relationship, particularly in my family, in my marriage, in my relationship with my children, my mother.
Mm.
Those have been big pieces of that growth has been realizing that I'm not fully healed from that. Well, you never over it, but you
Right.
never I hadn't done the work. That has pushed me to do the work so that I can be more loving, more
So I loved
caring.
how you used that word abundant, and how the way in which you utilize that word I thought was great, because
Mm,
it's everything is in an overabundance when something like this happens. And nobody should feel like you said when you were at the time, you tried to like be a certain way because you thought that
yeah,
was the way you're supposed to be, but there is no way you're supposed to be. You just need to be abundantly you.
right. And I mean, to borrow a page from our beliefs, you are called to be loving, and so sometimes loving is hard. Like it's not just a feeling. It certainly isn't just fleeting. It's not simple. It's complicated, and it takes different forms according to the need present.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of my healing process was realizing that in my anger, which was, no fault of my own, but it was real, that I was neglecting to be loving,
Yeah.
and that's where it became, in our tradition, sin or brokenness or whatever, and that I needed to do some work to heal that. So that anger is not the bad thing. It was precluding me from being loving.
Yeah. And so,
Um,
can I just say something just to clarify that when you say sin, sin is just whatever keeps us from being fully embracing and embraced by the love of God.
That exactly. Yeah, I hesitated to use that word because I know your listeners are broader than my tradition or our tradition. But it's the word we use in the Episcopal Church. But yeah, it's a loaded word. So thank you for
Loaded. It is hard because, again, I think as you go into the depth of whatever the tradition is, you recognize these words, they don't have to be the way so much of the sort of culture claims them to be, or what they were. They're
yeah.
everything's more nuanced, and
And how does that play out then for you, Ariane, in terms of how you've led? So you've taken that to heart, and it's how does that change the way you lead?
oh, well, it completely empowered me and gave me permission to realize, and I need to live it in ways where I'm meeting people where they are in their faith and spiritual journeys, but that's not always within the confines of my particular church or the confines of the Episcopal Church more broadly, or even Christianity.
Mm,
It's been I particularly, maybe that's why I love Richard Rohr so much. He talks a lot about having kind of a foot in both worlds, and I like that.
I like that too. I find that the more I spend time outside the church, the healthier I am in the church. To remember that the church actually is given as a sacrament for the world anyway. So try not to be. It's not given as a sacrament for itself. It's funny. One of the stumbling blocks at my particular parish that I have to remind myself regularly is not normal. A large portion of our parish here is theologically educated. So we have a lot of former clergy. We have bishops and priests and deacons who are
Wow.
retired or non-rostered, and we have a lot of theologians that worship here because there's a lot of universities, particularly liberal arts colleges, that are Lutheran, Presbyterian, Catholic in the area, and even evangelical. A lot of the faculty want to go to an Episcopal church
Yep.
if they're theologically educated. So we've always enjoyed or been challenged by a lot of people who are very very erudite theologically in our pews, and that's mixed with the truth of then a variety of other theological training, background, exposure, awareness. And I always, probably this is the old evangelical in me, but I always have tried to skew toward um, speaking to the world and not to the church. But
Okay, so because I'm gonna kind of bring us towards
yes,
the
yeah,
closing, even though, of course, as always, I could talk with you for a very long time, and don't be surprised if I ask you to come back. What are you preaching these days? And tell me, because that saying, they say all of us have one sermon, maybe two, and we
mm,
just preach it over and over again. So what are you preaching? What's the good news for you these days?
that's a great question. Um, I mean, it is the same. It feels like the pandemic. It didn't make it more urgent, although it is more urgent. What for me, the pandemic um, it was an apocalypse. It shed light on things that were always true. It just exposed them for all of us to see in greater clarity. And for me, theologically and practically, my sermons have always been, we need to practice our faith in community in order to be the kind of people who can live authentically in the world. Like, this thing we do at church isn't, we shouldn't take it for granted. It's not preening, and it shouldn't be it's not practice for the world. It's the proving ground. It's the place where we are literally made into Eucharistic people, baptismal people, which for the non-initiated just means folks whose lives look like love abundant, right? Like folks whose lives look like love spilled out for everyone. So to me, the good news the church has to offer is, here's a place where you can know love, encounter love, experience love abundant, but also where you have what's the line from To Call the Midwife? Something about the liturgy is a rope for harried souls. It's sort of like a line we can cling to, like something we can follow, and it pulls us along. And I don't take that for granted anymore. I mean, the other thing I'm preaching is, we've just, there was the other apocalypse of the pandemic was racism.
Yeah.
And so our church has just tried to dive full on into never steering around or softening truths that we've been reluctant to tell out loud, and even in the Episcopal Church for decades. And so trying to find that bit of truth that needs to be shared, so that we're never far from the truth of racism and our part in it. And that may not feel like good news, but I think anytime we tell the truth, we have a better chance of growing healing.
Well, yeah. I mean, I seem to recall somewhere there's a thing about, like, doesn't truth set you free?
I think that, yeah, somebody said that.
Yeah. Well, Jared Weber Johnson, okay, let me say thank you so much for being so abundant in sharing some of your story of who you are. I just resonate too with something I think we share. We've been in relationship with a community as pastors for a long time, and it's shaped us, and we recognize on a regular basis what a gift it's been in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I love hearing that from a colleague. It's beautiful.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and I know we were all over the place, and thank you for guiding us into fruitful conversation. It's been a gift just to have this chance to share, so thank you. Thank you for the invite.